Welcome back to another Legend tier list. This is the first one for set 9.5. And guess what? We have stats back again, so I can actually use stats in order to put together the Legend tier list. I haven't had one of these for a while, and I'm really happy to be able to put together one again using stats. I'm glad that they brought it back. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So in S tier, we have Ornn. He's not really S tier. We'll talk about why later on, but he has separated from the rest of the pack, which means most people will end up playing him. So I'll just put him in S tier for now, but it's not overwhelmingly a big difference like we've seen in some prior patches. Sol down in C tier, Bard in B tier, Caitlyn in B tier, Draven in D tier, Ezreal is in A tier, Lee Sin in C tier, Master Yi in C tier, Pengu in A tier, Poro in A tier, Tahm Kench in D tier, TF in A tier, Urf in B tier, Veigar in D tier, and then Vladimir in C tier. So I mentioned that stats are back. So let's get into showing what those stats look like. I kind of flashed it real quickly before. As you can see, Ornn is the best performing champion or legend. If you haven't seen this before, the way that I set this up is, let me go ahead and zoom out so that I can move over to one of the other screens. I pull up all the different legend augments. I get the stats for each one of those augments. I fill it all in. I multiply that by the probability that you're going to see each of those different augments at different stages in the game in order to calculate exactly what the expected value is for each legend at different stages in the game, as well as their overall expected value here. So there's a couple of ways you can look at this. The first thing you can look at is overall expected value. This gives you an idea of how much value a particular legend provides throughout the course of the game. Ornn, throughout the entirety of set 9 and 9.5 so far, has pretty much always been a legend that doesn't have a single stage in which his augments are bad. So all of them are averaging above, or rather below, a 4.5, which is phenomenal. But as you can see, this is pretty close to 4.5. So there are no legends that are just completely smashing everything else. If you go back to some of my prior tier lists, you saw some legends in like the 4.2 to 4.3 range. Those are true S tier legends. We don't have any real S tier legends. It's just that Ornn is good enough that probably everybody will play him. So in terms of his representation, he'll look like an S tier legend. But in terms of how much better he is than everything else, he probably won't look like an S tier legend like we've seen in the past. Outside of that, we've seen some surprises here, like Pengu moving up, mostly because his item augments are pretty good, and also his prismatic on 2-1 is phenomenal. And Ezreal is also doing quite well. Again, another one of those legends that kind of has a good augment at every stage of the game. TF is doing surprisingly well, partially because in this meta right now, there's a lot of Bilgewater players that are hard forcing RFCs on their Nyla, and Twisted Fate helps you get there. So I think this might even improve from where we are now as more people end up playing Bilgewater. Of course, by the time this video gets released, or by the time you're watching it, Bilgewater might have got hotfixed because it's just way too broken right now. I'm not sure if they're going to wait a week or not. So anyway, Twisted Fate is really strong right now, partially because of that, but also because they made some changes to his 4-2 augments to make them clickable, even though they're still not that good. Outside of that, really, everything else is hovering in this like 4.4 to 4.6 range. I would say anything that's between 4.4 and 4.6, more than playable. Everything below 4.6, still playable, but now you're starting to get into, like, this is your preference, this is your play style, and you're accepting the fact that maybe you're not playing optimally. That's sort of the way I would look at it for the most part, but there is not a single legend in the game right now that if you pick, you're just auto-losing. I still don't think you should play Tahm Kench. I don't think you should play Veigar. Veigar in particular, even though it may seem like his first augment is very powerful, the problem with Jeweled Lotus is that it's not very good on 2-1 because you don't have any champions at that point that are solid carries that can make good use of Jeweled Lotus. You don't have your traits online. You don't have all your items online. So crit scales off of all those different multipliers. And if you don't have those multipliers yet, Jeweled Lotus is not that impactful. That's why if you look at the stats for Jeweled Lotus on 2-1, it's a lot worse than it is at later stages of the game. So that's kind of the brief overview of where everybody stands. If we go back to the Legends tier list, I'll just kind of quickly move through each of the different Legends and talk about each one independently here. So Ornn, I mentioned this already, every single one of his items or every single one of his augments is good. There's not a single one of his augments that he offers that is just straight up, flat out bad. And as a result of that, you're going to use his augments as backups a lot of the time. And some of his augments are quite solid. Some of them are like 4.3 augments, 4.2 augments, which means most of the time you're going to end up picking them over your average, say, gold, silver, or prismatic augment. When we get into A tier here, again, there's not a huge difference here between A tier and S tier. Ezreal, also an items-based legend, and I would say that pretty similar story where there's not really any bad augments that you can get from Ezreal. Of course, there are better augments and worse augments, and you can use meta TFT or tactic.tools in order to identify those. But for the most part, all of his different augments are good. One thing I want to note is that his 4-2 augment, Well-Earned Comforts, the prismatic one, that one is actually pretty solid because it has an additional effect that effectively makes it like its own unique cybernetic effect where it gives attack speed, which no other augment in the game provides. So pretty interesting effect that he has on his 4-2 prismatic only. When we get into Pengu here, the big thing about Pengu is that he provides a lot of different useful items for his 3-2 augment, which is surprisingly good. And then his 4-2 augment, also sort of a similar situation where it gives items and I believe duplicators, which can be quite good. And then the main thing of note here is that his 2-1 augment is pretty good. Now, if we look at these stats, the way I have these stats set up is it's based on the probabilities that we see by default in the game. But it turns out that portals actually change the probability that you're going to see a silver, gold, or prismatic augment on 2-1. There are two particular portals that are important to note here, which is the University and Jace's Workshop. There's about an 8% chance that you will be in a game that has one of these two different portals, and that adjusts the probabilities in this way. And if you were to insert these probabilities here, you will notice a slight change in the tier list here. Let me go all the way back over this way, where you're going to see that Pengu actually moves a little bit closer to Ornn, where there's only a 0.05 difference between the two of them. So if you want to consider the possibility that there is a higher chance of prismatic on 2-1, if we actually, let me zoom out real quickly here. If you look at the prismatic for Pengu, he has by far the best 2-1 prismatic. So as a result of that, if you want to play that game where you're really just playing Pengu in order to get that 2-1 prismatic, because his other 2-1 augments are not that good, then you can do that. And that would be pretty reasonable to do. And it does pull Pengu up pretty considerably compared to other legends, especially if you are lucky enough to get Piltover on 2-1. If you get Piltover on 2-1 with Tiniest Titan, you're probably guaranteed first at that point. So that's one thing to note about Pengu. Poro, surprisingly, I thought he would be a lot stronger than he is. So if we go and look at the stats here, I have pulled up all of the average statistics for each of the different types of augments in the game. So your average silver, average gold, average prismatic at 2-1, 3-2, and 4-2. And when you compile all that information together, these are the results that you get for Poro. He actually averages a 4.54. And so that actually suggests that the legend-specific augments are averaging over a 4.5 because you can't get them with Poro. And I did exclude those legend-specific augments from the Poro statistics. So Poro is actually, he's okay. He's solid. He belongs to be in A tier. He always will be in A tier. There are some augments in the game like Rising Infamy that are absurd. And if you have higher probability of getting that on 2-1, 3-2, and 4-2, that is quite strong. But on average, it's not going to offset what you can get from some of these better legends, is my overall opinion. That said, all of the games I've played on 9.5 so far have been with Poro. I probably am going to change to Ornn after seeing the stats here, but I started 9.5 with Poro and really didn't notice any issues. I mentioned this with TF earlier, but the big thing about TF right now is that Bilgewater with Nyla is very popular. and you want to have at least 2 RFCs on Nyla. In most situations, that's ideal. If you're playing the game normally, it's very difficult to get 2 RFCs because bows are the highest in-demand item in the game currently as a result of the metagame. So in order to guarantee those items, you can play TF, and Bilgewater is very strong if you are able to get the correct items for it. So TF is performing relatively well right now. His 3-2 augment is also pretty solid at this point in time. So TF is actually in a reasonable spot if you want to play him and force Bilgewater or some other comp, like maybe Azir that's doing quite well right now. You can do that as well. When we get into B tier here, Bard sort of does, I feel like, a worse job than both Ornn and Ezreal. That's why he's in B tier here. So if we actually look at the statistics here, all of his 2-1 augments are not performing that well. He has the same 3-2 augments as Ornn, and his 4-2 augments, just generally speaking, aren't the strongest here. He basically has some of what I think Pengu has and 1 augment from Ornn. Actually, no, sorry. He has 1 of the augments or 2 of the augments from Twisted Fate. They have the same thing with teaming up, and then they have a different silver augment on 4-2, but the one thing to note is that you practically never get silver augments on 4-2. It's a very low probability, so it's pretty much irrelevant. And so Bard is really just a worse version of Ezreal and Ornn, in my humble opinion. Play him if you want to, but again, probably better off just playing Ezreal or Ornn if you're looking to get additional items. Caitlyn continues to fill the same role that she's filled for the last couple of patches, which is if you think there is a really strong 1 or 2 cost carry that you can have in the early game and play Stars Are Born, I think Caitlyn will continue to perform quite well. This can be relatively strong with rogues, because if you're able to get Graves 2 and Quiana, however you say it too, early game, that's pretty impactful and can help you get set up for playing rogue reroll. So that's probably the best use case for Caitlyn right now. But just in general here, she's kind of filling the same role that she's filled in the past, which is you're just trying to play for a strong early game. Urf also in the same position that he's typically been in. So the stats always are going to say that Urf is worse, I think, than he really is, because the stats always suggest that his 2-1 augments are quite bad. That said, when I was playing Urf at the end of set 9, and when I say the end of set 9, I probably mean the penultimate patch, not the actual last patch, Urf felt fine. It actually felt pretty enjoyable to play if you actually studied the metagame and knew which emblems were good. Like, for example, Bilgewater is really strong right now. Void seems to be doing pretty well right now. So there's a couple of different augments that you might be able to tailor for in the early game that might be relatively strong. If you have knowledge of that and can play towards that, Urf will probably do relatively well for you. If you don't have knowledge of that and you're playing purely flexibly with whatever you get, that's probably going to underperform some of these other options. But Urf, again, playing the same role that he always has, which is you're playing for those emblems on 2-1, and then you're tailoring your game plan around that. His 3-2 and 4-2 augments are still, I would say, relatively good. All right. Now we move into C tier. So A-Sol is in C tier here. Part of why I think A-Sol is in C tier is because the Fast 9 comp just isn't that strong as of right now. I feel like they really neutered Bel'Veth to a certain extent that makes it difficult to play her as a carry. They also kind of nerfed Ahri a lot through a couple of different patches, and I just generally feel like the Fast 9 comp is not going to outperform 7 Bilgewater in a lot of cases. That would be the major issue here, to be honest with you, is the fact that 7 Bilgewater is punching way above its weight class, where if somebody has Nyla with double RFC, 7 Bilgewater, and upgraded units, they're probably going to win against you, even if your board outvalues theirs by like 30 plus gold. So it's very difficult to make an econ-based legend work right now because of how powerful Bilgewater is. It feels like going Fast 9 just isn't as rewarding as just playing for Nyla. Now, of course, this might change if this gets hotfixed. So that's sort of where I stand with A-Sol, is that while Bilgewater is in the meta and as powerful as it is, probably stay away from A-Sol. This might change if 5 costs get buffed, of course, or if even just Bilgewater gets nerfed. Lee Sin. Now, Lee Sin is mostly used for reroll. That's supposed to be his big thing. Probably the best use case for Lee Sin right now would be with Rogue Reroll. Rogue Reroll is pretty solid. The other option I could see being possibly pretty good with Lee Sin would be Cho'Gath Reroll. So right now, Cho Bite is one of the better comps out there. Unironically, it used to be a complete meme comp, but if you actually look at the stats behind it now, Cho is actually doing relatively well if you're able to hit that 6 bruiser with 3-star Renekton, 3-star Cho'Gath, and ideally 3-star Malzahar as well. So Lee Sin probably pretty good with those two different lines. I would argue it's better with Cho Bite because that's a 1-cost reroll, but it's probably relatively solid with the Rogue reroll if you're going for like Graves and Qiyana as well. So that's where I stand with Lee Sin. Master Yi, honestly, Master Yi I feel like is not... There has been some consideration as to whether or not Master Yi might be good with Bilgewater with the gotta go fast and how that would work with Nyla. But the truth is, I don't think it would work all that well because Nyla already is pretty much always has 100% uptime. Gotta go fast is really just about increasing the uptime of melee units. And so I don't really see that being a very strong combination, but there has been some discussion of it. I tend to think that Master Yi for right now, especially after they did a couple of nerfs to pumping up during the PBE, sort of is going to remain in this C tier for now. Vladimir, if you look at the stats, I actually think belongs in D tier. Yeah, he's all the way down here at 4.77. The main reason I have him in C tier here is I'm operating under the assumption that maybe in the future there will be some sort of line that is discovered that works well with all three of his augments. Vladimir has always been a legend where all three of his augments synergize together exceptionally well. I would say better than any other legend in the game if you're able to make it work. So the main issue is that Transfusion getting offered on 2-1 when you're at 100 HP makes it a little bit weaker, but Transfusion still remains, I think, his strongest augment. So yeah, I kind of... Right now I have him in C tier because of his potential, not really where the stats show him as being. He should be in D tier if we were just focusing on stats. Moving on to Draven. So Draven is a legend that if you want to have fun, you want to play with Spoils of War, especially with the soft MMR reset if you're playing against noobs, it could be pretty fun. You could scale pretty high and have a pretty enjoyable game if you are smurfing. Outside of smurfing circumstances, though, usually Draven is just going to put you on the back foot because you're playing with Spoils of War, which doesn't really do anything unless you already have a strong board. And if you already have a strong board, you're probably going to do fine anyway. So it's sort of a win more legend, been in that spot for a while. And most of his other augments, aside for 2-1, are not that impactful, to be honest with you. So Draven still continues to be in this spot outside of the one patch where he went crazy. Sort of still feels like a win more legend that doesn't do a whole lot. Tahm Kench continues to be one of the worst legends in the game. They refuse to buff him for some reason. I don't know why, even though they had a whole tournament where everybody had to pick Tahm Kench, but they still won't buff him. He's still just as bad as he's always been. If we look at the stats here, he's averaging a 4.81. I guess that's actually a little bit better because in the past I've seen him as low as 5. But yeah, it's not looking good for Tahm Kench, and it doesn't look like it will look good in the future, given that he's been in this state for several patches now, and they just won't do anything to help the poor guy. So we'll see what happens with Tahm Kench, but it seems like they are very cautious of Econ Legends after what happened with Draven. We'll see what happens. And then lastly, we have Veigar here. I already talked about Veigar a little bit earlier, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but the main issue with Veigar is that his 2-1 augment, Jeweled Lotus, it is a phenomenal augment. Well, when I say phenomenal, it's a good augment, all right? It's a solid combat augment, but only if you take it on 3-2 and 4-2, because you need to have some traits active and some items active to really get the scaling you need off of being able to crit with your abilities. Crit is a multiplicative applier, right? It's making you do more damage based off of the base damage that you have. And if you don't have traits online or items that are increasing your damage, then that multiplier is multiplying a small base. It's pretty straightforward, but that's part of why the 2-1 augment for Veigar in particular is not that good. Tiny Power is not that good on 3-2, and Ascension is the currently the worst performing augment in the game for all the legends. So unfortunately, Veigar is finding himself at the bottom of the tier list. And that's it. That's all the legends for 9.5. Hopefully that helps you with getting into the game and understanding what you should be playing. For the most part, I recommend Ornn, Ezreal, Pengu, Poro, or TF if you're going to play Bilgewater. Other than that, you can play any of the B tier and honestly any of the C tier champions and probably still do just fine. Just note that when you get into C tier and D tier, this is sort of starting to get into somewhat of this is my play style and I'm stubborn and I don't want to change. That's sort of the territory that you're in. As long as you understand that, then you're going to climb and have fun. See you next time.